10 biblical signs that God is teaching you to live resiliently. Something has been changing inside you, quietly but unmistakably. Life has not necessarily become easier, yet you have not broken the way you once did. The pressure still comes, the uncertainty still visits, and there are moments when your strength feels insufficient, yet you remain standing. You continue moving forward even when the path is unclear. And deep within, a question begins to form. Why am I still standing when everything around me still feels difficult? There comes a season in the walk with God when He is no longer only comforting you, He is strengthening you. He does not always remove the storm because He is forming something within you that can endure it. Many people misunderstand this stage. They believe resilience means becoming hard, distant, or emotionally closed. But biblical resilience is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of faith that refuses to let go of God even when comfort fades, even when answers delay, even when the heart feels tired. You may have noticed that your faith is changing. It feels less emotional yet more grounded, less dramatic yet more steady. You react differently, you recover differently, you trust differently. This is not coincidence. God often builds resilience quietly, shaping a heart that remains anchored in Him when life becomes heavy. He is not teaching you merely to survive difficult moments. He is teaching you to remain faithful within them. Scripture shows that resilience is not born in ease. It is formed when faith chooses trust over fear, obedience over escape, and surrender over control. Jesus Himself walked this path, not by avoiding suffering, but by remaining aligned with the Father through it. And when God begins forming this kind of strength within a person, life may feel heavier, but the soul becomes steadier. If you have felt stretched, refined, or quietly strengthened, do not assume something is wrong. God may be teaching you to live resiliently, not by removing weakness instantly, but by transforming your foundation. And as this transformation unfolds, certain signs begin to appear, subtle at first, yet unmistakable once understood. The first sign often begins where many expect relief, but instead encounter a deeper invitation. One of the clearest signs that God is teaching you to live resiliently is when you stop needing immediate relief in order to keep trusting Him. In earlier seasons, your faith may have been closely tied to visible comfort. When pressure increased, you asked God to remove it. When pain appeared, you prayed for quick resolution. And many times He answered by bringing relief, because early faith often grows through reassurance. But resilience is formed in a different way. There comes a point when God begins teaching you to remain faithful, even when relief does not arrive quickly. You may notice that certain struggles linger longer than you expected. Some prayers feel unanswered for a time. Situations remain unresolved. Yet something within you refuses to collapse. You still pray. You still trust. You still move forward, not because everything feels better, but because your faith is no longer rooted only in comfort. It has begun to root in relationship. This is the beginning of resilience. It is the quiet shift from needing God to change your situation immediately, to trusting Him while the situation remains unchanged. This does not mean the pain is less real. It does not mean the pressure disappears. It means your faith has stopped depending on relief in order to survive. Scripture reveals this pattern throughout the lives of those God strengthened. Many were not rescued instantly, but they were sustained. Paul pleaded for his struggle to be removed, yet God answered by giving strength rather than relief. Jesus in the garden did not escape the path before Him, yet He remained aligned with the Father. Resilience is not formed when everything becomes easy. It is formed when faith remains alive even when ease is absent. When you no longer lose your footing simply because relief has not come, something powerful is taking place within you. Your trust is shifting from outcome to presence. You begin to understand that God's faithfulness is not measured by how quickly circumstances change, but by how consistently he sustains you within them. This kind of trust anchors the soul beyond emotion and teaches the heart to endure without losing alignment. You may still long for relief, and that longing is human, but resilience appears when the absence of relief no longer weakens your faith. You begin to recognize that God is not ignoring you. He is strengthening you. He is teaching you to remain faithful not only when life feels light, but when it feels heavy. And as this stability forms, another quiet transformation begins. You do not only endure difficulty, you begin to recover differently after each fall, rising with a steadiness you did not have before. Another clear sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears in how you recover after moments of weakness. You are not untouched by pain. You still feel disappointment, pressure, and sometimes discouragement, but something has changed in the way you rise again. Where you once remained down for long periods, now you begin to stand sooner. Where failure once defined your identity, now it becomes a moment, not a destiny. This is resilience forming beneath the surface. There was a time when emotional wounds lingered longer, when mistakes produced shame that paralyzed your faith, when discouragement felt heavier than hope. But now, even when you fall, something within you refuses to stay there. You may still feel the weight, but you do not lose your direction. You may feel shaken, but you do not lose your foundation. This does not mean you have become stronger by your own power. It means God is strengthening your inner life, teaching you how to stand again without losing your trust in Him. Scripture shows that resilience is not the absence of falling, but the refusal to remain fallen. Peter denied Jesus, yet he returned. David stumbled, yet he sought God again. The righteous may fall, yet they rise, not because they are flawless, but because their faith remains alive. God does not build resilience by preventing every fall. He builds it by teaching the heart to return, to realign, and to continue walking even after weakness is exposed. You may notice that failure no longer silences your prayer. Discouragement no longer stops your obedience. Shame no longer convinces you to withdraw from God. Instead, you find yourself returning more quickly, seeking alignment rather than hiding in distance. This is a sign of growth. It reveals that your identity is no longer rooted in your performance, but in your relationship with God. And when identity is rooted correctly, failure loses its power to define you. Resilience transforms how you see weakness. You no longer see it as the end of your journey, but as a place where God continues His work. You begin to understand that falling does not separate you from Him when your heart remains turned toward Him. Instead of running from God in moments of struggle, you run toward Him. This shift is profound because resilience is not built by avoiding weakness, but by learning to rise through it without losing faith. As this recovery becomes steadier, another quiet change begins to appear. You start obeying even when you do not fully understand. Even when God does not explain everything, you remain aligned. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience deepens beyond emotion and enters the realm of trust without clarity. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when you continue to obey, even when He does not explain everything. In earlier seasons, clarity often came quickly. Direction felt defined. You sensed reassurance before taking steps forward. But as resilience begins to form, God sometimes allows silence where you once expected answers. Not because He is distant, but because He is strengthening your trust beyond understanding. You may notice moments where you wish for clear instruction, yet none comes immediately. You pray, you wait, and instead of detailed explanation, you sense a quiet invitation to keep walking. This can feel uncomfortable because the human heart longs for certainty. Yet resilience grows when faith learns to move without full visibility. You are no longer obeying because every outcome is explained. You are obeying because your trust in God has deepened. Scripture shows this pattern repeatedly. Abraham walked without knowing the full path before him. Joseph endured years without understanding how his suffering would be redeemed. Even Jesus, in his humanity, trusted the Father beyond immediate explanation. Their obedience was not based on clarity alone, but on relationship. And this is how resilience is formed. God teaches the heart to remain aligned, not only when understanding is present, but when trust must lead the way. You may feel tension in this season. Questions arise, yet answers delay. You want certainty, yet you are invited into faith. But notice what is happening within you. You are still walking. You are still seeking God. You are still choosing alignment even without complete clarity. This is not confusion, it is formation. God is teaching you to anchor your obedience in who He is, not only in what you can see. When obedience continues without full explanation, resilience deepens. You become less dependent on emotional reassurance and more grounded in spiritual conviction. You begin to understand that faith is not proven when everything is clear, but when the heart remains steady, even in uncertainty. And through this process, God strengthens your inner stability, preparing you to remain faithful in moments where clarity may not come quickly. As this trust matures, another change begins to appear. Your emotional life becomes steadier. The intense highs and lows that once defined your reactions begin to soften, replaced by a deeper stability that does not depend on circumstance. And this is where the next sign begins to unfold. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when emotional stability begins replacing emotional intensity. There was a time when your inner life felt like a cycle of strong rises and deep falls. Moments of inspiration lifted you quickly, and moments of pressure shook you deeply. Your faith often felt powerful when emotions were high, and fragile when emotions were heavy. But now, something within you has begun to shift. You are becoming steadier, even when feelings fluctuate, even when circumstances remain uncertain, even when life does not immediately improve. This does not mean you have become distant or emotionally closed. It means your foundation is moving deeper than emotion. You still feel joy, you still feel sorrow, you still experience pressure, but these emotions no longer control your direction. Your peace is no longer tied to perfect conditions. Your faith no longer rises and falls with every situation. Instead, something quieter yet stronger is forming within you, a stability that remains present even when emotions are unsettled, a groundedness that holds you when feelings attempt to pull you in different directions. Scripture shows that maturity brings steadiness. Jesus experienced sorrow, yet he remained aligned. Paul endured suffering, yet he remained anchored. Their strength did not come from the absence of emotion, but from being rooted in something deeper than emotion. This is how resilience grows. God teaches the heart to stand firm, not because feelings are always calm, but because trust is anchored beyond them. Emotional intensity often seeks immediate reassurance, but resilience is built when faith remains steady even without emotional reinforcement. You may notice that situations which once overwhelmed you now feel different. The pressure may still exist, but it no longer destabilizes you the same way. You feel the weight, yet you remain present. You pause before reacting. You pray before deciding. You reflect instead of collapsing. This is not emotional numbness. It is spiritual strength taking root. God is teaching you to respond from conviction rather than impulse, from trust rather than fear, from alignment rather than reaction. Your inner life is no longer ruled by emotional waves. It is being anchored by spiritual depth. As emotional stability grows, your reactions begin to change. You no longer respond immediately to every disturbance. You become more attentive, more discerning, more deliberate. You begin to recognize that not every emotion requires action, and not every feeling defines truth. God is training your heart to remain steady, to listen before moving, to remain aligned even when inner tension exists. This steadiness creates endurance, and endurance is essential for resilience. You may also notice that your need for emotional reassurance begins to lessen. Where you once needed strong feelings to confirm God's presence, you now sense Him in quiet steadiness. Faith becomes less dramatic but more durable, less intense but more rooted. This is not decline, this is depth. Emotional intensity can ignite faith, but emotional stability sustains it over time. God is not removing your passion. He is anchoring it so that it can endure without being consumed by fluctuation. This transformation also reshapes how you experience peace. Peace is no longer the absence of tension, but the presence of alignment. You may still face uncertainty, you may still encounter pressure, yet beneath it, there is a steadiness that was not there before. This is resilience forming in its deeper stage. God is building a heart that can remain grounded when life is unpredictable, a heart that does not collapse when emotions rise, a heart that stays aligned even when feelings are unsettled. As this stability becomes part of your inner life, another quiet shift begins to appear. You no longer lose your footing when plans change or expectations fail. Instead of collapsing under disruption, you begin to adapt without losing your inner balance. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience continues to grow, shaping how you respond when life does not unfold the way you expected. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when you no longer collapse when plans change. There was a time when unexpected turns unsettled you deeply. You built expectations, imagined outcomes, and when life moved differently, your peace seemed to disappear. Disappointment felt disorienting. Delays felt heavy. Changes felt threatening. But now, something within you is becoming steadier. Plans may still shift, doors may still close, outcomes may still surprise you, yet you no longer lose your inner footing the same way. You feel the disruption, but you do not collapse under it. This change does not come from emotional detachment, it comes from spiritual grounding. You begin to understand that your peace cannot depend entirely on circumstances unfolding exactly as you hoped. God is teaching you to remain anchored in Him, not in the certainty of your plans. When resilience begins forming, expectations lose their power to control your stability. You still plan, you still hope, you still move forward with intention. But your foundation is no longer built on outcomes alone. It is built on trust. Scripture reveals this pattern in the lives of those God strengthened. Joseph saw his life change direction suddenly and painfully, yet he remained aligned. David was anointed long before his path unfolded clearly, yet he continued walking faithfully. Even the early disciples followed Jesus without knowing where the journey would lead, trusting Him more than their understanding of the path. Their resilience did not come from predictable outcomes, but from anchored faith. You may notice that when things do not go as expected, your first response is changing. Instead of panic, there is pause. Instead of frustration, there is reflection. Instead of immediate reaction, there is prayer. This does not mean disappointment disappears. It means disappointment no longer defines your direction. God is teaching you to remain steady even when life rearranges your expectations. He is shaping flexibility within faith, the ability to adapt without losing alignment. Resilience requires this flexibility because life does not always unfold in straight lines. God sometimes redirects, sometimes delays, sometimes allows paths you did not anticipate. And in these moments, the heart either resists or learns to trust. When you begin adjusting without losing peace, it reveals that your trust is no longer tied to certainty. You are learning that God's faithfulness is not limited to your original plan. He remains present even when the path changes. This transformation also changes how you view disappointment. What once felt like loss begins to feel like redirection. What once felt like confusion begins to reveal purpose over time. You begin to see that not every closed door is rejection, and not every delay is denial. God sometimes reshapes the path to strengthen the traveler. And resilience grows when the heart remains open, steady, and willing to continue walking even when direction shifts. You may still feel moments of uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer destroys your stability. You remain present, attentive, and anchored. This is resilience deepening. God is forming a heart that can endure change without losing peace, a heart that can adapt without losing trust, a heart that remains aligned even when life moves unexpectedly. As this flexibility strengthens, another quiet transformation begins to emerge. You learn to stand even when you feel alone, not with isolation, but with a deeper sense of God's presence. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience grows through a form of strength that does not depend on constant external reassurance. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when you learn to stand even in moments of solitude without feeling abandoned. There was a time when being alone felt heavy, when the absence of visible support created insecurity, when silence felt like distance. You may have depended more on reassurance, on constant confirmation, on the presence of others to feel stable. But now something deeper is forming within you. You are learning to stand quietly, not because life has become easier, but because your awareness of God's presence has grown stronger. This does not mean you no longer value people. It does not mean you are meant to walk in isolation. It means your stability is no longer dependent on constant external reinforcement. God sometimes allows seasons where you feel less supported, less affirmed, less surrounded, not to weaken you, but to strengthen your inner foundation. In these moments, He teaches you that His presence is not measured by how many voices surround you, but by the quiet assurance within your spirit. Scripture reveals that many who walked closely with God experienced seasons of solitude. Moses stood in the wilderness before leading a nation. Elijah found himself alone before being renewed. Even Jesus withdrew into solitude, not out of weakness, but out of alignment with the Father. Solitude, when guided by God, is not abandonment, it is formation. It is where faith learns to stand without depending on constant external confirmation. You may notice that in moments when you feel alone, you do not collapse the way you once did. You still seek God, you still pray, you still move forward. There is a quiet strength within you that was not there before. You are learning that God's presence does not disappear when human reassurance fades. This realization builds deep resilience because your stability becomes rooted in something unshakable. In these seasons, God often refines your dependence. He removes the need for constant affirmation and replaces it with inner assurance. You begin to understand that faith is not proven when you feel surrounded, but when you remain steady even when you feel alone. This does not isolate you from others. It strengthens your capacity to stand, to endure, and to remain aligned without fear of silence. You may also notice that solitude begins to feel different. What once felt empty begins to feel purposeful. What once felt uncertain begins to feel clarifying. You become more attentive, more reflective, more aware of God's quiet guidance. In the absence of noise, you begin to hear deeper truth. This is not distance. This is intimacy forming through stillness. God often builds resilience where distractions fade and the heart learns to remain present with Him. As this inner strength grows, your identity becomes less dependent on approval and more rooted in alignment. You do not seek constant validation to remain steady. You do not fear silence the same way. You begin to recognize that God is with you even when the path feels quiet. And this realization produces a deeper stability, one that prepares you to carry responsibility without needing constant reassurance. As you learn to stand without feeling abandoned, another transformation begins to unfold. You start carrying responsibility even when recognition is absent. You continue walking faithfully, not because others see, but because your alignment with God has become your true foundation. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience deepens through faithfulness that does not depend on applause. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when you continue carrying responsibility even when recognition is absent. There was a time when visible results, appreciation, or acknowledgement strengthened your motivation. Being seen confirmed your direction. Being recognized reassured your effort. But now something deeper is forming within you. You continue even when no one notices. You remain faithful even when there is no applause. You carry what has been entrusted to you, not because it brings visibility, but because your alignment with God has become your foundation. This shift is subtle yet powerful. Recognition is not wrong, but resilience grows when faithfulness no longer depends on it. You may notice that you continue serving, continue standing, continue obeying, even when your effort is unseen. There is no stage, no reward, no affirmation, yet something within you remains steady. This is not emotional detachment, it is spiritual grounding. God is teaching you to remain faithful in hidden places, where identity is not built on approval, but on relationship with Him. Scripture reveals that much of God's work is formed in obscurity. Joseph remained faithful in prison before his influence was revealed. David tended quietly before stepping into leadership. Even Jesus lived years of hidden obedience before his public ministry began. Their strength was not built in recognition, but in quiet faithfulness. God often develops resilience where the heart learns to remain aligned without external validation. You may notice that your motivation is changing. You are no longer driven by how visible your progress appears, but by how aligned your heart remains. This transformation protects you. Recognition can fluctuate, approval can shift, but alignment with God remains steady. When your faith is rooted there, you can continue walking even when no one sees your effort. This is resilience in its mature form. It allows you to remain faithful without needing constant affirmation. In hidden seasons, God refines intention. He reveals why you continue. Is it for recognition or for obedience? Is it for approval or for alignment? As this clarity deepens, your faith becomes less dependent on external reinforcement and more anchored in inner conviction. You begin to understand that God sees what others cannot, and His approval carries greater weight than human recognition. This stage also strengthens humility. When faithfulness continues without applause, the heart remains grounded. Pride has no space to grow where recognition is absent. God forms resilience through quiet endurance, teaching you to remain steady even when your effort is unseen. This prepares you for greater responsibility because true strength does not rely on external validation to remain faithful. You may still appreciate encouragement, but you no longer depend on it to keep moving forward. Your faith has become rooted in something deeper than visibility. You remain aligned because you trust God, not because others acknowledge you. And through this process, resilience continues to grow, shaping a heart that remains faithful in both hidden and visible seasons. As this hidden strength develops, another quiet transformation begins to appear. Your faith begins to remain steady, not only in difficulty, but in repetition. You continue walking faithfully, not only in intense moments, but in ordinary days. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience deepens through constancy in seasons that feel quiet and repetitive. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when your faith remains steady, not only in intense moments, but in repetition. There was a time when your faith felt most alive during crisis, when urgency sharpened your focus, when pressure pushed you closer to God. Difficult moments awakened your prayers, strengthened your attention, and deepened your dependence. But ordinary days felt different. Routine felt quiet. Progress felt slow. And faith sometimes felt less intense when life seemed stable. Yet now, something deeper is forming within you. You continue walking faithfully even when nothing dramatic is happening. This change reveals a new level of resilience. You no longer rely on crisis to remain connected. You pray not only when you feel desperate, but when life feels ordinary. You remain aligned not only when pressure forces you, but when routine invites consistency. This kind of faith is quiet, yet powerful. It does not depend on emotional urgency. It grows through constancy. God often forms resilience not in extraordinary moments, but in ordinary repetition, where faith learns to remain alive without external intensity. Scripture shows this pattern clearly. Daniel prayed consistently regardless of circumstance. The early believers remained devoted daily, not only in moments of persecution. Jesus himself lived years of quiet obedience before his public ministry began. Their strength did not come from constant dramatic events, but from steady faithfulness over time. Resilience grows when the heart remains aligned not only in storms, but in stillness. You may notice that routine no longer weakens your faith. Repetition no longer drains your motivation. Instead, there is a quiet persistence within you. You continue praying, you continue trusting, you continue obeying. Not because you feel intense emotion, but because your faith has rooted deeper than emotion. This transformation is subtle but profound. It reveals that your connection with God is no longer reactive, but sustained. In seasons of repetition, God refines endurance. He teaches you to remain faithful when progress feels slow, when results are unseen, when life feels predictable. This is where many lose momentum, but resilience is formed when faith remains steady, even without visible change. You begin to understand that spiritual growth is not always dramatic. Often, it is quiet, gradual, and deeply transformative beneath the surface. This constancy also strengthens discipline. You no longer depend on inspiration to remain faithful. You act from conviction. You move from alignment rather than impulse. And through this steady rhythm, your inner life becomes stronger, more grounded, more resilient. You are no longer shaken by the absence of intensity. You remain present, attentive, and anchored, even in quiet seasons. As this endurance deepens, another transformation begins to emerge. You become less reactive and more responsive. Instead of being driven by immediate emotion, you begin acting with discernment and clarity. And this leads to the next sign, where resilience reveals itself through a new level of inner control and spiritual awareness. Another sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears in the way you respond rather than react. There was a time when emotions moved you quickly. Words, situations, and pressures triggered immediate reactions. You spoke before reflecting. You acted before discerning. You felt pulled by urgency, by fear, by frustration, sometimes even by the need to defend yourself. But now, something within you has begun to change. There is a pause where there once was impulse. There is awareness where there once was reaction. You still feel, but you are no longer driven blindly by what you feel. This transformation is subtle, yet powerful. Reaction is fast, emotional, and often unstable. Response is steady, intentional, and aligned. God is teaching your heart to move from impulse to discernment, from emotional reflex to spiritual awareness. This does not mean you feel less. It means your inner life is no longer ruled by every disturbance. You begin to notice your thoughts before they turn into words. You begin to recognize your emotions before they shape your actions. This awareness is not weakness. It is resilience taking form within you. Scripture reveals that strength is often shown in restraint. Jesus was provoked, yet remained composed. He was questioned, yet answered with wisdom. He was pressured, yet remained aligned with the Father. His power was not expressed through impulsive reaction, but through intentional response. And this is how resilience grows. God teaches the heart to remain steady under pressure, to respond with clarity rather than react with instability. You may notice that situations which once escalated quickly now unfold differently. You pause, you listen, you reflect, you pray before acting. This pause is not hesitation, it is discernment. It allows truth to guide your response rather than emotion to drive your reaction. And as this pattern strengthens, your stability deepens. You are no longer controlled by external pressure, you are guided by inner alignment. This shift also changes how you handle conflict, pressure, and uncertainty. Instead of being overwhelmed by what happens around you, you remain attentive to what is forming within you. God is strengthening your capacity to remain calm without becoming passive, to remain firm without becoming harsh, to remain clear without becoming rigid. This balance is the essence of resilience. It allows you to stand steady even when life becomes intense. As your responses become more grounded, your peace becomes less fragile. External disturbances may still occur, but they no longer destabilize your inner life the same way. You begin to understand that resilience is not the absence of pressure, but the ability to remain aligned within it. God is shaping a heart that listens before moving, discerns before acting, and trusts before reacting. And as this inner clarity deepens, the final sign begins to emerge. You start trusting God even when the outcome remains uncertain, not because you see the full path, but because your faith has learned to remain steady beyond certainty itself. The deepest sign that God is teaching you to live resiliently appears when you continue trusting Him even when the outcome remains uncertain. There was a time when your peace depended on knowing how things would end. You felt secure when the path was clear, when direction felt confirmed, when results seemed predictable. Uncertainty unsettled you. The unknown created tension. The absence of clarity felt heavy, but now something deeper has begun to form within you. You are learning to remain steady even when you do not know how everything will unfold. This kind of trust does not come naturally. It is shaped through experience, through moments where God does not reveal the entire path at once, through seasons where you must continue walking without full visibility. You may still desire clarity, and that desire is human, but your faith no longer collapses in the absence of certainty. You continue praying, you continue trusting, you continue moving forward. Not because you see the outcome, but because you trust the one who guides the path. This is resilience in its deepest form. Scripture reveals that many who walked closely with God lived in this tension. Abraham stepped forward without knowing where the journey would lead. Joseph endured years of uncertainty before understanding the purpose behind his trials. The disciples followed Jesus without fully grasping what lay ahead. Their peace was not rooted in clear outcomes, but in trust formed through relationship. God was not revealing everything at once, yet they continued walking because trust had grown deeper than certainty. You may notice that uncertainty no longer produces the same fear within you. Questions may still arise, but they do not paralyze your faith. You remain present, you remain aligned, you continue seeking God rather than retreating into doubt. This transformation reveals that your foundation is shifting from control to trust. You no longer require full understanding in order to remain steady. You have begun to understand that God's faithfulness is not dependent on how clearly you see the future, but on how faithfully you remain aligned in the present. This trust reshapes your inner life. Anxiety begins to lose its grip. You no longer feel the same urgency to control every outcome. You learn to move with openness, to walk with patience, to remain attentive rather than restless. God is teaching you that resilience is not built by predicting the future, but by remaining anchored in Him regardless of what the future holds. This does not remove uncertainty, but it removes the fear that uncertainty once created. You may still face moments where clarity is limited, yet your peace remains steadier than before. This is not denial, it is alignment. God is forming a heart that can endure without needing complete answers, a heart that remains faithful without needing constant confirmation, a heart that trusts not because everything is visible, but because God is present. When this level of trust begins to form, resilience reaches its mature stage. You are no longer standing because life is predictable. You are standing because your foundation is anchored in God. And when faith reaches this depth, something profound becomes clear. God was not only helping you survive difficult moments, He was shaping you to remain steady, faithful, and aligned regardless of circumstance. If you recognize this transformation within you, understand what it means. God has been forming resilience in your spirit. Not loudly, not suddenly, but faithfully. And what He forms with patience, He sustains with purpose. You are not standing by accident. You are being strengthened to endure, to remain, and to walk forward with a faith that does not collapse when life becomes uncertain. What you have been experiencing is not random. It is formation. Quiet, steady, intentional formation. God has not been shaping you merely to endure a season, but to become a person who can remain faithful across seasons. Resilience is not a moment of strength. It is a posture of the soul. It is the ability to stay aligned when life presses, to stay grounded when emotions fluctuate, to stay faithful when outcomes remain unseen. And if you have recognized these signs within your life, then something deeper has already begun. You may still feel stretched. You may still feel the weight of uncertainty. You may still face moments where your strength seems limited, but notice what has changed. You are not collapsing the way you once did. You are not retreating the way you once did. You are not losing faith the way you once feared you would. This is evidence of transformation. God has been strengthening your inner life, teaching your heart to remain anchored even when circumstances do not change immediately. Resilience does not remove struggle. It redefines how you stand within it. Where fear once dominated, trust begins to grow. Where instability once ruled, steadiness begins to form. Where doubt once weakened your direction, conviction begins to guide your steps. This process is not loud, but it is powerful. God does not rush this work, because what is built slowly becomes durable. What is formed deeply becomes stable, and what is rooted in Him cannot be easily shaken. You may still wonder what God is preparing you for. Often He forms the heart before revealing the assignment. He strengthens the foundation before expanding responsibility. If clarity about the future feels distant, do not be troubled. God often withholds the full picture while ensuring that the posture of the heart is ready. When responsibility comes before maturity, it overwhelms. But when maturity is formed first, responsibility becomes stewardship rather than burden. Do not rush this process. Do not measure your faith by how easy life feels. Measure it by how faithfully you remain aligned when life becomes demanding. Continue seeking God in quiet moments. Continue choosing trust when certainty is absent. Continue standing even when the path feels long. Resilience grows through faithful steps, not sudden leaps. God has not been distant from you. He has been shaping you. He has been strengthening what will sustain you beyond temporary circumstances. And what He begins, He completes. You are not being prepared for a single moment of strength, but for a life marked by steadiness, faithfulness, and quiet endurance. Remain attentive, remain grounded, remain with God. The strength forming within you is not temporary. It is the foundation of a faith that endures.